Think you know everything about the summer blockbuster that made people afraid to go in the water? From a mechanical shark that refused to work to drunken actors hiding their real identities, the making of Steven Spielberg's masterpiece was stranger than fiction. Local kids broke into warehouses to play on the fake shark. A severed head was filmed in someone's backyard pool. And one of cinema's most famous lines was completely improvised. Here are the 15 weird facts you didn't know about Jaws 1975. Fact 1. The shark was named after Spielberg's lawyer. When Steven Spielberg and his crew were preparing to film Jaws in 1974, they needed a nickname for their massive mechanical star. The three 25-foot animatronic sharks that would terrorize the fictional town of Amity Island were impressive pieces of engineering, weighing over a ton each and requiring teams of technicians to operate. But rather than choosing something fierce or intimidating, Spielberg decided to name all three sharks after someone much more mundane: his lawyer. The director chose the name Bruce after his attorney Bruce Raymer, who worked for the prestigious Beverly Hills law firm that represented some of Hollywood's biggest names. Raymer wasn't just any entertainment lawyer. He had built a career representing A-list celebrities and would go on to work with stars like George Clooney, Robert Zemeckis, and Clint Eastwood throughout his decades-long career. The choice was partly tongue-in-cheek, as Spielberg jokingly suggested that his mechanical shark was about as reliable as his legal counsel. This naming decision turned out to be oddly prophetic, because Bruce the Shark would prove to be just as troublesome as dealing with complicated Hollywood contracts. The mechanical creatures were designed by production designer Joe Alves and built by Bob Matty, who had previously created the giant squid for Disney's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Each Bruce was constructed with a steel skeleton, hydraulic systems to move the jaws, and pneumatic mechanisms to control various body parts. The nickname stuck throughout production and became so widely known that crew members would radio updates about Bruce's condition during the notoriously difficult shoot. When one of the sharks malfunctioned, which happened constantly, the crew would report that Bruce is down or Bruce needs repairs. The name became so associated with the film that decades later, Pixar would pay homage to this bit of movie history by naming the friendly shark character in Finding Nemo after Spielberg's mechanical nightmare. Fact 2. Local kids broke Bruce by playing on it. While the Jaws production team struggled with their temperamental mechanical shark throughout filming, they may have had some unexpected help in creating those breakdowns. Jeffrey Voorhees, the young actor who played shark victim Alex Kintner in the film, later revealed that local Martha's Vineyard children regularly snuck into the warehouse where Bruce was stored and treated the expensive movie prop like their personal playground. According to Voorhees, security around the shark storage facility was practically non-existent by 1970 standards. There were no alarm systems, no security cameras, and apparently no one thought to properly secure the building that housed one of the most important and expensive elements of the entire production. This created the perfect opportunity for curious local kids who had heard about the giant mechanical shark being built in their neighborhood. Voorhees described how groups of children would find open windows and climb through them with flashlights, turning the warehouse into their own after-hours adventure zone. Once inside, they would climb all over Bruce, wiggling the shark's massive teeth, scrambling up onto its tail, and generally treating the sophisticated animatronic creature like an elaborate jungle gym. The kids had no idea they were potentially damaging a piece of movie equipment that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars and required teams of skilled technicians to operate. What makes this story even more remarkable is that these nighttime visits may have actually contributed to the mechanical problems that plagued the production. Bruce was already struggling with the harsh saltwater environment of Martha's Vineyard, but the additional wear and tear from enthusiastic young visitors could have made the situation even worse. Voorhees admitted that looking back, their innocent fun might explain why the shark broke down so frequently during filming, adding an entirely new dimension to the production's well-documented technical difficulties. The irony is that while the adult crew members were working around the clock to keep Bruce functioning, local children were unknowingly sabotaging their efforts during their off-hours adventures. Fact 3. A real woman's arm replaced the fake one. When it came time to film the gruesome discovery of Chrissy Watkins' remains on the beach after her nighttime shark attack, Steven Spielberg ran into a problem that many horror directors faced: making fake body parts look convincingly real. The opening scene of Jaws establishes the deadly threat of the shark through Chrissy's terrifying attack in the dark ocean, but the aftermath needed to be just as impactful for audiences to understand the creature's lethal power. Originally, the prop department had created an artificial arm that was supposed to represent what was left of Chrissy after her encounter with the great white shark. The scene called for the severed limb to be discovered partially buried in the sand, serving as a shocking visual reminder of the shark's presence, and giving Chief Brody his first real evidence that they were dealing with something far more dangerous than a typical beach accident. However, when Spielberg looked at the footage with the prop arm, he immediately knew it wouldn't work. The fake limb looked exactly like what it was: an obviously artificial movie prop that would pull audiences right out of the terrifying reality he was trying to create. In a film where the mechanical shark was already proving problematic and unconvincing at times, Spielberg couldn't afford to have other effects look equally fake. His solution was both simple and slightly bizarre. Instead of spending time and money trying to create a better prop, Spielberg decided to use a real human arm. The production team found a willing female crew member who agreed to be buried in the sand up to her shoulder, with only her actual arm sticking out to be filmed. This created the realistic look that Spielberg needed, while keeping the scene disturbing enough to establish the serious threat facing the residents of Amity Island. The makeshift approach worked perfectly, giving the discovery scene an authentic and unsettling quality that helped ground the film's supernatural elements in believable horror. Fact 4. The famous bigger boat line was improvised. One of the most memorable and frequently quoted lines in movie history wasn't actually written by any of the screenwriters working on Jaws. When Chief Brody delivers the now iconic phrase, "You're gonna need a bigger boat," Roy Scheider was completely making it up on the spot, creating what would become one of cinema's most enduring catchphrases through pure improvisation. The line occurs during the film's climactic third act, when Brody, Quint, and Hooper are out on the ocean hunting the massive great white shark aboard Quint's fishing vessel, the Orca. It's the moment when the shark first reveals its true, terrifying size by rising out of the water behind an unsuspecting Brody, who is throwing chum into the ocean to attract their target. The sight of the enormous predator completely catches him off guard and prompts his deadpan observation about their vessel's inadequacy. According to screenwriter Carl Gottlieb, who was working on script revisions throughout the production, Scheider came up with the line entirely on his own during filming. The spontaneous nature of the delivery perfectly captured Brody's character, a New York police chief who was already uncomfortable on the water and completely out of his element when faced with a 25-foot killing machine. Scheider's natural reaction as an actor translated into what felt like a genuine human response to an impossible situation. What makes this improvisation even more remarkable is how perfectly it fit the moment and the character. The line works on multiple levels. It's simultaneously funny and terrifying, understated yet completely accurate, and it captures the helpless feeling that both the characters and the audience experience when confronted with the shark's overwhelming presence. The phrase has since transcended the film itself, becoming a widely recognized way to express that someone is unprepared for the magnitude of a challenge they're facing. Gottlieb later confirmed that this perfect moment of movie dialogue came entirely from Scheider's instincts rather than any script. Fact 5. John Williams' theme was initially considered a joke. What would become one of the most recognizable and terrifying pieces of music in film history almost never made it into the movie because the director thought it was a prank. When John Williams first sat down at the piano to play his proposed theme for the shark in Jaws, he performed the now famous two-note motif that has become synonymous with impending danger in popular culture. Steven Spielberg's immediate reaction was to burst out laughing. The composer had created what seemed like an impossibly simple musical idea. Just two alternating notes played in a menacing, repetitive pattern, that would grow faster and more intense as the shark approached its victims. To Spielberg, this basic musical phrase seemed almost comically minimal for such an important element of the film. After Williams finished playing, the young director looked at him and said, "That's funny, John, really. But what did you really have in mind for the theme of Jaws?" Spielberg genuinely believed that Williams was joking around before presenting his actual composition. The director was expecting something much more complex and traditionally orchestral, perhaps a sweeping melody or an elaborate musical arrangement that would match the epic scope of their monster movie. Instead, Williams had stripped the concept down to its most primal elements, creating something that worked almost like a musical heartbeat or the rhythm of a predator's approach. Williams had to convince Spielberg that he was completely serious about using this deceptively simple theme. The composer explained his reasoning. The two-note pattern was meant to represent the shark's relentless, primitive nature and create an instant sense of dread that would build tension even when the creature wasn't visible on screen. The minimalist approach would make the music instantly memorable and allow it to burrow into audiences' minds. The theme that Spielberg initially dismissed as a joke would go on to win Williams an Academy Award and launch one of the most successful composer-director partnerships in Hollywood history, spanning dozens of films over the following decades. Fact 6. The severed head scene was shot in someone's pool. One of the most effective jump scares in Jaws was created not in the Atlantic Ocean off Martha's Vineyard, but in a suburban backyard swimming pool in Encino, California. The terrifying moment when Ben Gardner's severed head suddenly pops out of his sunken boat's hull was filmed months after the main production had wrapped, using the most unlikely of movie sets. Film editor Verna Field's personal swimming pool. After principal photography was complete, Steven Spielberg decided he needed one more big scare to really make audiences jump out of their seats. The original scene where Matt Hooper discovers Gardner's damaged boat and finds evidence of the shark attack wasn't delivering the shock value that Spielberg wanted for the film. He felt the movie needed an additional moment of pure terror that would catch viewers completely off guard. Rather than reassemble the entire crew and return to Martha's Vineyard for additional ocean filming, Spielberg came up with a much more practical and budget-friendly solution. He recruited a small crew and headed to Field's home in Encino, where they would transform her backyard pool into a convincing replica of the murky Atlantic waters. The team created a fake severed head using a life cast of Craig Kingsbury, the local fisherman who played Ben Gardner in the film. To make the clear, chlorinated pool water look like the dark, murky ocean surrounding Martha's Vineyard, the crew poured an entire gallon of milk into the water. This simple trick clouded the water enough to create the perfect underwater atmosphere for the jump scare. They then covered the pool with a tarpaulin to control the lighting and create the claustrophobic feeling of being inside a sunken boat's hull. The makeshift setup worked perfectly, creating what test audiences identified as the loudest scream moment in the entire film. Spielberg and screenwriter Carl Gottlieb would later sneak into theater screenings just to watch sold-out audiences physically jump from their seats during this pool-created moment of terror. Fact 7. Robert Shaw got too drunk to film his famous speech. The most powerful and haunting monologue in Jaws almost never happened because its star was too intoxicated to speak. Robert Shaw's chilling performance as Quint recounting the USS Indianapolis disaster is widely considered one of the greatest pieces of acting in the film, but the road to capturing that perfect take involved a spectacular failure that became legendary among the cast and crew. Shaw was known for his heavy drinking throughout the production, and he had convinced Steven Spielberg that having a few drinks before filming the Indianapolis speech would help him get into the right emotional state for the scene. The monologue required Quint to reveal his deepest trauma. Surviving the sinking of the USS Indianapolis during World War II, where hundreds of sailors were left floating in shark-infested waters for days before being rescued. Shaw argued that alcohol would help him access the raw emotion needed to deliver such a personal and painful story. Spielberg, trusting his experienced actor's judgment, agreed to let Shaw have some drinks before the cameras rolled. However, Shaw's idea of a few drinks turned out to be far more than anyone anticipated, and by the time filming was supposed to begin, the actor was completely unable to function. According to the cast and crew, Shaw became so drunk that he had to be physically carried to the set, and once there, he couldn't get through his lines without slurring or forgetting his dialogue entirely. The attempt to film the scene was a complete disaster, with Shaw unable to deliver the emotional intensity that the monologue required. Recognizing that they weren't going to get anything usable, Spielberg called off filming for the day. The next morning, Shaw called Spielberg at 4 a.m, mortified by his behavior and asking how badly he had embarrassed himself. Spielberg diplomatically told him it wasn't fatal, and they scheduled the scene to be reshot. The following day, with Shaw completely sober, they captured the Indianapolis monologue in just one take, creating one of cinema's most memorable moments. Fact 8. The shark malfunctioned because it had never been tested in salt water. The mechanical shark that nearly destroyed the Jaws production suffered from a fundamental design flaw that no one discovered until it was too late. Bruce had never been properly tested in the ocean environment where it would actually need to perform. All of the extensive testing and preparation for the sophisticated animatronic creature had taken place in freshwater tanks back in Los Angeles, which created a false sense of confidence about how well the shark would function once filming began. When the crew first lowered Bruce into the Atlantic Ocean off Martha's Vineyard, the results were immediately catastrophic. The 25-foot mechanical shark, which had cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to build and had performed reasonably well in controlled freshwater conditions, sank straight to the bottom of the ocean like a massive steel anchor. The salt water began attacking the shark's internal systems almost immediately, creating problems that the designers had never anticipated or prepared for. The corrosive effects of salt water proved to be Bruce's greatest enemy throughout the production. The ocean water leaked into the pneumatic hoses that controlled the shark's movements, causing the pressure systems to fail and making it impossible for operators to control the creature's jaws, fins, and body movements. The salt also corroded both the interior mechanisms and the exterior skin of the shark, causing the supposedly non-absorbent neoprene foam covering to soak up seawater and balloon to ridiculous proportions. The mechanical failures were so constant and severe that Spielberg later calculated that during their 12-hour daily work schedules, the crew was only able to spend about 4 hours actually filming. The rest of the time was spent retrieving Bruce from the ocean floor, attempting repairs, or waiting for the technical team to solve whatever new problem the salt water had created. These breakdowns forced Spielberg to completely rethink his approach to the film, ultimately leading him to hide the shark for most of the movie and rely on suggestion rather than showing the mechanical creature that simply refused to work in its intended environment. Fact 9. Richard Dreyfuss only took the role because he hated his previous performance. Richard Dreyfuss almost never became the marine biologist Matt Hooper in Jaws because he had initially turned down the role, convinced that working on a movie about a killer shark would be a nightmare to film. However, a moment of crushing self-doubt about his acting abilities would ultimately change his mind and lead him to one of his most memorable performances. When Steven Spielberg first approached Dreyfuss about playing Hooper, the young actor said no without much hesitation. Dreyfuss correctly predicted that filming on the ocean would create massive logistical problems and delays, and he had no interest in dealing with the inevitable complications that would come from shooting a major motion picture on the water. He was so against taking the part that he even tried to convince Spielberg to abandon the entire project, believing it would be impossible to complete successfully. Dreyfuss had just finished filming a movie called The Apprenticeship of Duddy Kravitz, a Canadian film that he thought would help establish his career as a serious dramatic actor. However, when he attended a pre-release screening of the completed film, his confidence was completely shattered. Watching himself on screen, Dreyfuss became convinced that his performance was so terrible that his acting career might be over before it had really begun. Panicked about his future prospects in Hollywood, Dreyfuss immediately called Spielberg and practically begged for the role in Jaws that he had previously rejected. His fear that no one would want to hire him after seeing his work in Duddy Kravitz made him desperate to secure another acting job, even if it meant enduring the difficult ocean filming he had wanted to avoid. The irony is that the apprenticeship of Duddy Kravitz would actually earn Dreyfuss rave reviews and help establish his reputation as a talented actor, while his last-minute decision to join Jaws would launch him into movie stardom and begin a long collaboration with Spielberg that would span multiple films. Fact 10. The film created the Jaws effect, mass shark killings. Jaws didn't just terrify audiences and keep them out of the water during the summer of 1975. It also triggered an unexpected and devastating real-world consequence that conservationists would later call the Jaws effect. The film's portrayal of sharks as mindless killing machines inspired a massive wave of shark hunting that led to the deaths of thousands of these ocean predators across the United States. In the months and years following the movie's release, fishing tournaments specifically targeting sharks became incredibly popular as people sought to kill what they now viewed as dangerous monsters lurking in their coastal waters. According to reports from the time, legions of amateur and professional fishermen piled into boats with the specific goal of hunting down and killing sharks, treating them like a pest that needed to be eliminated rather than an important part of the ocean's ecosystem. These shark fishing tournaments and individual hunting expeditions resulted in massive numbers of shark deaths, with some estimates suggesting that thousands of sharks were killed in the immediate aftermath of the film's popularity. The fear that Jaws created was so powerful that many people genuinely believed they were making their local waters safer by removing as many sharks as possible, not understanding the crucial role these predators play in maintaining healthy ocean environments. Both Peter Benchley, who wrote the original novel, and Steven Spielberg would later express deep regret about this unintended consequence of their work. Benchley eventually became a passionate shark conservationist and campaigned actively to protect shark populations, saying that Jaws was entirely a fiction and working to educate people about the real nature of these creatures. Spielberg also acknowledged his regret about the decimation of the shark population because of the book and the film. Conservation groups continue to struggle with the negative stereotypes about sharks that the movie created, noting that the film made it considerably harder to convince the public that sharks should be protected rather than feared and eliminated. Fact 11. Quint was based on a real local fisherman. Robert Shaw's iconic portrayal of the grizzled shark hunter Quint wasn't created from imagination alone, but was instead based on a real Martha's Vineyard local who became deeply involved in the production of Jaws. Craig Kingsbury was an eccentric fisherman, farmer, and legendary island character who caught Steven Spielberg's attention during the filming and became the inspiration for one of cinema's most memorable supporting characters. Spielberg was immediately fascinated by Kingsbury, describing him as the purest version of who, in my mind, Quint was, after observing the colorful local fishermen around Martha's Vineyard during production. Kingsbury embodied everything that Spielberg wanted Quint to represent: a weathered, authentic New England maritime character with decades of experience on the water, and an unvarnished way of speaking that came from a lifetime of hard work. Shaw studied Kingsbury's mannerisms, speech patterns, and personality to develop his performance, spending time with the real fisherman to understand how someone like Quint would actually behave and talk. The observation paid off so well that Spielberg decided to cast Kingsbury himself in the film as Ben Gardner. The fisherman whose damaged boat and severed head provide crucial evidence of the shark's presence. What made Kingsbury's influence even more significant was how his authentic maritime language found its way directly into the script. Spielberg and the writers were so impressed by Kingsbury's colorful expressions and unique way of speaking that they wrote many of his actual phrases and mannerisms into the dialogue for both Quint and Ben Gardner. This gave both characters an authenticity that would have been impossible to achieve through traditional screenwriting alone. The collaboration between Shaw and Kingsbury created a character that felt genuinely rooted in the maritime culture of New England, rather than a Hollywood version of what a fisherman might be like. Kingsbury's real-world experience and personality became the foundation for Quint's believable and compelling presence throughout the film's most dramatic sequences. Fact 12. The crew nicknamed the Broken Shark's flaws. As the mechanical problems with the Jaws sharks became more and more frequent and frustrating, the cast and crew's affection for their expensive animatronic co-star began to sour dramatically. What had started as the friendly nickname Bruce gradually transformed into something much less endearing as the production stretched on and the technical difficulties mounted day after day. The three mechanical sharks had been designed to be the stars of the show, sophisticated pieces of movie magic that would bring the terrifying great white to life on screen. However, the constant breakdowns caused by saltwater corrosion, pneumatic system failures, and general mechanical problems turned these impressive creations into the bane of everyone's existence on the Martha's Vineyard set. After weeks of dealing with sharks that would sink to the ocean floor without warning, refuse to move their jaws when needed, or simply stop functioning entirely in the middle of crucial shots, the frustrated crew members started referring to their mechanical nightmares by a new, much more accurate nickname: flaws. This bitter play on the original Bruce name perfectly captured how the crew felt about the expensive equipment that was supposed to make their jobs easier, but instead was making the production a daily struggle. The name change reflected the growing sense of exasperation among everyone working on the film. Instead of radioing updates about Bruce's condition, crew members would report that Flaws is down again, or Flaws needs more repairs. The new nickname became so widespread that it was used throughout the remainder of the production whenever the mechanical sharks inevitably malfunctioned. This shift from Bruce to Flaws perfectly captured the evolution of the crew's relationship with their mechanical co-star, transforming from initial excitement and optimism about the sophisticated movie technology to resigned frustration with equipment that seemed determined to sabotage their efforts to complete the film. The sarcastic nickname became a way for the cast and crew to cope with the endless technical difficulties that were pushing the production over budget and behind schedule. Fact 13. There's a hidden Moby Dick reference that couldn't be used. Steven Spielberg had planned to include a direct and darkly humorous reference to Herman Melville's classic novel Moby Dick in Jaws. But legal complications involving one of Hollywood's biggest stars prevented the scene from ever making it to the screen. The planned sequence would have made the connection between Quint and Captain Ahab explicitly clear while revealing something disturbing about the shark hunter's psychology. In Spielberg's original draft of the screenplay, there was a scene where Quint goes to a movie theater to watch the 1956 film adaptation of Moby Dick, which starred Gregory Peck as the obsessed Captain Ahab. The scene was designed to show Quint's twisted sense of humor and his identification with Ahab's relentless pursuit of the white whale that had destroyed his leg and consumed his life. According to the script, Quint would sit in the theater laughing continuously and inappropriately throughout the dramatic film, finding genuine amusement in Ahab's tragic obsession and ultimate destruction. His laughter would become so disruptive and unsettling to the other moviegoers that they would gradually get up and leave the theater, unable to tolerate his disturbing reaction to what was supposed to be a serious, dramatic story. The scene would have served multiple purposes. It would have established the clear literary connection between Jaws and Moby Dick, shown Quint's dark personality and his own obsession with hunting sharks, and demonstrated how his experiences had affected his view of stories about man versus nature. The parallel between Quint and Ahab was already built into the character, but this scene would have made it unmistakable to audiences. However, when the production team tried to license footage from the Moby Dick film to use in their scene, they discovered that Gregory Peck himself owned the copyright to that particular adaptation. Peck refused to grant permission for his film to be used in Jaws, effectively killing the scene and forcing Spielberg to find other ways to establish Quint's character and his connection to the classic tale of obsessive hunting. Fact 14. Real shark footage used a dwarf stuntman. While most of Jaws was filmed using mechanical sharks off the coast of Martha's Vineyard, some of the most terrifying underwater footage actually came from real great white sharks filmed thousands of miles away in Australian waters. To make this authentic shark footage work with the rest of the movie, the production team had to solve a challenging problem: how to create the right sense of scale when combining real sharks with their 25-foot mechanical Bruce. The solution involved filming with a dwarf stuntman who doubled for Richard Dreyfuss's character Matt Hooper during the underwater cage sequences. Since the mechanical Bruce was designed to be an enormous 25-foot monster, any footage of real sharks needed to make the actual creatures appear equally massive and threatening when placed next to a human being in the water. The real great white sharks used in the Australian footage were impressive predators, but they weren't nearly as large as the fictional shark in the movie. To create the illusion that these real sharks were the same size as Bruce, the filmmakers needed to film them next to a much smaller person, making the sharks appear proportionally larger and more menacing than they would have looked next to an average-sized actor. The dwarf stuntman wore the same scuba gear and occupied the same metal shark cage that would be used in other scenes with Richard Dreyfuss, but his smaller stature made the real sharks look much more imposing and dangerous on camera. This clever trick allowed the production to seamlessly blend the authentic underwater shark footage with the scenes filmed using the mechanical shark, creating a more convincing and terrifying overall effect. The technique worked so well that audiences had no idea they were watching footage of real sharks combined with scenes of mechanical ones, or that different-sized actors had been used to create the proper scale. The Australian shark footage added an element of genuine menace and unpredictability to the film that would have been impossible to achieve using only the mechanical shark, which spent most of its time broken down on the ocean floor. Fact 15. The original Jaws sharks were lost, but Junkyard Bruce survived. After causing so much trouble during production, the 3 original mechanical sharks from Jaws met an inglorious end that seems almost fitting for creatures that had tormented cast and crew for months. When filming wrapped, Universal Studios simply dumped all 3 expensive animatronic sharks in the studio's backlot, where they were left to rot away and eventually disappeared entirely, taking with them one of cinema's most famous movie props. According to production designer Joe Alves, the studio had no interest in preserving the mechanical sharks once filming was complete. The production had been so difficult, and the sharks had caused so many problems, that no one at Universal saw any value in keeping them around. The cast and crew were exhausted from dealing with the constantly malfunctioning creatures, and the studio executives were just relieved that the movie was finally finished and Bruce was no longer their responsibility. However, there was a 4th shark that most people didn't know about. A static, non-mechanical version that had been created for promotional purposes and outdoor advertising. This promotional shark was made from the same molds as the working versions, but didn't have any of the complex internal machinery that had caused so many problems during filming. After the movie's success, this 4th Bruce was apparently forgotten and eventually ended up in a California junkyard. In 1990, 15 years after Jaws had terrified audiences, this forgotten promotional shark was discovered in the Ailden Brothers auto wrecking yard. The junkyard owners recognized the historical importance of what they had found and preserved the 25-foot fiberglass shark until their business closed in 2016. Nathan Ailden, whose family owned the junkyard, then donated what fans call Junkyard Bruce to the Academy Museum of Motion Pictures in Los Angeles. The museum had the shark professionally restored by special effects artist Greg Nicotero, and it now hangs on permanent display, allowing visitors to come face-to-face with the legendary movie monster that launched the summer blockbuster era.